My name is Sophronia Hayes. I'm 36 years old, a single mother, and I live in Portland, Oregon. Most people who meet me for the first time describe me in the same polite, forgettable ways. Quiet, practical, dependable. I suppose that's fair. I've never been the loudest voice in a room. I don't chase attention, and I've never believed that strength needs to announce itself. For most of my life, I've simply focused on doing what needed to be done. Raising my son, paying the bills, and trying to teach him something far more important than success: dignity. If you saw me standing in line at the grocery store, you probably wouldn't look twice. I wear simple clothes, drive an older car, and I tend to keep my thoughts to myself. And that's exactly the reason people sometimes assume they understand my life at a glance. But stories like this rarely begin with the person people expect. This one actually begins with my son. For months, he went to school wearing the same jacket every single day. The same faded navy jacket, zipped up no matter the weather, no matter how warm the classroom was. Children notice things adults miss. And children can also be brutally honest. At first, it was whispers, then giggles, then open jokes. Why did he never take it off? Did he only own one jacket? Was he trying to hide something? The other kids laughed at him for months. Teachers noticed the teasing, of course. Schools always try to manage things like that carefully. But in a busy classroom, small things sometimes pass as harmless childhood behavior, the kind that fades on its own. Except this one didn't. Because what nobody realized, not the students, not even the teachers, was that my son wasn't wearing that jacket because he liked it. He was wearing it because he refused to take it off. And when the truth finally surfaced, when one teacher finally discovered the reason behind that stubborn little decision, everything in that school changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, and certainly not overnight, but quietly, the way real consequences usually arrive. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about humiliating anyone or proving anyone wrong. It's about something much simpler and much harder. It's about how a child held on to something important long after everyone else decided it didn't matter. And it's about the moment an adult finally realizes why. Before I begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone be misunderstood for so long that people eventually stopped asking why? For most people at my son's school, I was simply Eli's mom. Not in a memorable way, just the quiet parent who arrived on time, signed the forms, nodded politely during meetings, and never made a scene. The kind of parent teachers rarely worry about. Dependable, calm, easy to overlook in a crowded hallway of louder personalities. I understood the role immediately when Eli started second grade. Other parents formed quick circles in the parking lot every morning. Conversations about soccer schedules, birthday parties, new cars, and upcoming vacations. Friendly enough, but the kind of friendliness that floats on the surface. I would smile, say good morning, and walk Eli to the front doors. That was usually where the conversations stopped. Part of that distance was practical. I worked early hours at a small community legal clinic, organizing case files and scheduling consultations for people who couldn't always afford legal help. The job paid modestly, but it mattered to me. It also meant I rarely had the luxury of lingering in the school parking lot. But the other part of the distance was something people sensed immediately, even if they couldn't quite explain it. I was quiet. Not shy. Not unfriendly. Just quiet. And in most social environments, quiet people are placed into a category very quickly. Reliable, harmless, background, invisible, in the gentlest possible way. Eli inherited some of that quietness from me. He wasn't withdrawn or unhappy. In fact, at home he could talk endlessly about astronomy, insects, and the strange mechanical curiosity he had about how things worked. If a toy broke, he didn't cry about it. He disassembled it. But at school, He tended to observe more than he spoke. I used to wonder if teachers noticed that about him. Some did. Most didn't. A classroom with 20 children has its own gravity. The loud ones pull attention naturally. The confident ones lead games and conversations. The shy ones either adapt or slowly fade into the background. Eli didn't disappear completely, but he existed just outside the center of things. The first time I realized how other people perceived us was during a short parent-teacher conference early in the year. His teacher, Ms. Callahan, was kind and professional. She spoke warmly about Eli's reading level, his focus during assignments, and his thoughtful answers when he chose to participate. Then she paused and said something that stuck with me longer than she probably intended. He's a very easy student. Easy. I knew what she meant. Teachers appreciate children who follow instructions, finish their work, and rarely cause disruptions. In a busy classroom, easy can be a relief. But sometimes easy also means less attention, less curiosity about the child behind the quiet behavior, less reason to ask deeper questions. I didn't take offense. Ms. Callahan was doing her job well, and she genuinely cared about her students. But I also understood something she didn't yet know. Children like Eli sometimes carry things silently for a long time before anyone notices. At home, he was thoughtful but happy, curious, steady. Nothing seemed wrong. And that's why, when the first small signs appeared later that fall, the ones that would eventually lead to that jacket, they were easy for everyone else to overlook. Everyone except me. Because when you spend years being underestimated yourself, you learn to recognize the quiet shifts that other people miss. And sometimes those shifts begin with something very small, something most people would dismiss as nothing at all. Something like a single comment made during recess that no adult happened to hear. The first time I noticed something had changed, it didn't look like much. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October. The air outside had started to cool, and the maple trees near the school parking lot were already turning orange. I arrived a few minutes earlier than usual, which meant I had time to watch the students spill out through the front doors. Eli was usually easy to spot, not because he stood out, quite the opposite. He walked with a kind of steady rhythm, backpack snug against his shoulders, eyes quietly scanning the ground the way thoughtful kids often do. But that day, he stepped outside wearing something new, a navy jacket. It wasn't brand new exactly. I had bought it secondhand from a neighborhood thrift store a week earlier. The fabric was still strong, but the sleeves had faint signs of wear, and one seam had needed a careful stitch. Eli had chosen it himself. "I like this one," he'd said at the store, running his fingers across the thick material. "It feels solid." So when I saw him wearing it that afternoon, I smiled, until I noticed the group of boys walking behind him. They weren't saying anything loud enough for teachers to hear, but children don't always need volume to communicate something unkind. Sometimes a glance is enough, a quiet laugh, a nudge between friends. One of the boys pointed briefly toward Eli's jacket. Another leaned in and whispered something. The group chuckled. Eli kept walking. If you weren't paying attention, you might have missed the moment completely. It lasted only a few seconds before the boys ran ahead toward the buses. But I saw the small change in Eli's posture. Just a slight tightening of his shoulders. The kind of adjustment children make when they're trying to pretend they didn't hear something. When he reached the car, he climbed in quietly. "How was school?" I asked, starting the engine. "Fine," he said. That was Eli's usual answer. I glanced at the jacket. "You like the new one?" He nodded. "Yeah." Then he stared out the window as we drove home. Nothing else about the afternoon seemed unusual. At home, he finished his homework, ate dinner, and spent an hour reading a book about planets before bed. If I had asked him directly whether someone teased him, he probably would have said no, not because he wanted to hide it, But because children sometimes don't recognize teasing at first, they assume it's temporary, a joke that will fade the next day. And often it does. But the next morning, Eli wore the jacket again. The weather didn't require it. The day was warmer than the afternoon before. Many children arrived in short sleeves. Still, Eli zipped the jacket carefully all the way up to his collar. I noticed it but didn't comment. By the end of the week, something subtle had become routine. Every morning, every afternoon. The same navy jacket. Even when the temperature climbed. At first, I assumed it was simply comfort. Children sometimes latch onto clothing that makes them feel secure. A favorite hoodie. A pair of shoes they refuse to replace. But the following Monday, when I arrived for pickup again, I heard something clearer. Two girls standing near the entrance were whispering while watching Eli walk past. "Does he even own another jacket?" one of them said. The other shrugged. "Maybe it's the only one he has." They giggled softly. It wasn't cruel in the dramatic way people imagine bullying. It was quieter than that. Small comments, passing jokes, tiny assumptions that slowly build into a story. And once a story starts spreading among children, it becomes difficult to stop. That afternoon, as Eli buckled his seatbelt, I asked a simple question. "Do kids ever say anything about your jacket?" "Asait tenan sama masasant." He thought about it for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Sometimes." "What do they say?" "Just stuff." He didn't sound upset, but he also didn't take the jacket off the entire drive home. Not even once. At the time, I assumed the teasing would pass. Children move on quickly when something new captures their attention. I didn't realize yet that this small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else, was the beginning of something that would follow my son for months. And more importantly, I didn't yet understand why he refused to take that jacket off. By the second week, the jacket had become part of Eli's routine. Every morning, he reached for it automatically, even when the weather didn't quite justify it. He slid his arms through the sleeves with the quiet determination children sometimes have when they've made a private decision. I watched it happen day after day. At first, I assumed it would fade. Children move on quickly when something new captures their attention. A new game at recess, a classroom project, a birthday party invitation. All of those things usually replace small teasing. But this time, the pattern didn't disappear. It settled. And once something settles into the rhythm of a classroom, it starts to feel normal. The jokes became more confident. Not loud enough to trigger intervention from teachers, but clear enough for the children involved to understand the hierarchy forming around them. One afternoon while waiting near the bike rack, I overheard two boys talking again. "Look," one said quietly, nudging the other as Eli walked by. "Same jacket." The other boy smirked. "Maybe he sleeps in it." "Sais astayenan." They laughed, not cruelly, just casually, the way children laugh when they believe everyone already agrees with the joke. That was the moment I realized something important. The teasing had stopped being an event. It had become an assumption. Eli was now the kid with the jacket. And once children assign someone a role like that, it tends to stick. At home, though, Eli behaved almost exactly the same. He still talked about his books, still asked questions about how bridges worked, still sat at the kitchen table, carefully finishing his homework before dinner. If the comments bothered him deeply, he didn't show it in obvious ways. But there were small changes. He started leaving the house earlier in the mornings. "Bus comes in 10 minutes, he would say, even when I knew he still had plenty of time. He stopped mentioning recess stories. And he never, not once, took the jacket off when we were outside the house. Even at the grocery store, even during a weekend trip to the library. At first, I tried to approach the situation gently. "Are you sure you're not getting too warm in that?" I asked one Saturday while we walked across the parking lot. "I'm fine," he replied. "You can take it off if you want." I like it. His answers weren't defensive. They were calm, almost practiced, which told me something I hadn't expected. Eli had already decided this wasn't something he wanted to discuss. Most parents know the difference between a child hiding something and a child simply holding on to something privately. This felt like the second. So I didn't push, because sometimes pushing too early causes children to close doors that might have opened later. At school, though, the quiet comments continued. Teachers occasionally corrected obvious teasing, the way they always do. Let's be kind. Everyone has different clothes. Focus on your own work. But those reminders only address the surface. What happens in classrooms is more subtle than that. Children read each other constantly. Who receives attention? Who leads games? Who gets laughed at? And once a pattern begins, it spreads without needing constant words. Eli wasn't being openly bullied. He was simply being defined. The quiet kid. The kid with the same jacket every day. The kid who didn't react. From the outside, it looked small. From the inside, though, something else was forming. Because while the other children were getting used to the story they had created about my son, Eli was getting used to not correcting them. And that was the part that made me pay attention. Not the teasing, not the whispers, but the fact that he never tried to explain. He just kept wearing the jacket every single day, as if the reason mattered more to him than anyone else's opinion. At the time, I still didn't know what that reason was, but I could already sense something about the way he protected it. And sometimes when a child protects something that carefully, it means the truth is far more important than anyone realizes. By the time November arrived, the story had already settled into place. Not officially. No one had written it down, but everyone seemed to understand it. Eli was the boy who wore the same jacket every day, and I was simply his quiet mother. In most schools, parents slowly find their social positions without ever discussing them. Some become organizers of events. Some volunteers are in classrooms. Some lead fundraising groups or sports teams. Others, like me, exist just outside those circles. Not excluded exactly, just not expected to participate. At first, I thought the distance came from my work schedule. I rarely had the flexibility to volunteer during school hours, and I didn't attend every informal gathering that other parents organized. But over time, I realized something simpler was happening. People had placed me into a role. Reliable, polite, low maintenance. The parent who signs permissions slips quickly and never sends long emails. The parent who won't cause complications. It's a comfortable category for institutions. Schools run more smoothly when some families simply trust the system and step back. And for the most part, I did trust the system. Teachers have difficult jobs. Administrators juggle hundreds of students. Not every small problem requires parental intervention. So when Eli continued wearing the jacket, and when the quiet jokes continued circulating among students, I told myself something reasonable. This will pass. Children change their focus constantly. One week, they tease someone about shoes. Next week, they're arguing about a video game. Surely this would fade the same way. But what I didn't fully appreciate yet was how roles influence perception. Once someone is labeled the quiet kid, people stop asking deeper questions. Once a parent is labeled the easy parent, teachers assume there are no hidden complications. And slowly, without anyone intending harm, attention shifts elsewhere. One afternoon in late November, I arrived early again for pickup. The air had turned cold enough that most students were wearing coats now, but Eli still wore the same navy jacket, zipped neatly, sleeves slightly longer than his wrists. As the children walked out, I noticed Ms. Callahan speaking with another teacher near the entrance. She glanced briefly toward Eli. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," she said when I approached. "Good afternoon." She smiled warmly. Eli had a good day. Finished his science project early. "I'm glad to hear that." Amayastein. There was a short pause, the kind that sometimes appears when someone is deciding whether to mention something small. Then she said gently, I've noticed Eli really likes that jacket. Her tone wasn't critical, more curious than anything. I nodded. Yes, he does. Kids have been making a few comments, she added. Nothing serious, but I remind them to be kind. I appreciate that. And I did. But the conversation ended there, because in that moment, both of us followed the roles we had unconsciously accepted. She treated it as a minor classroom dynamic, and I responded as the calm, cooperative parent who didn't escalate small issues. Neither of us pressed further. Neither of us asked the question that might have changed things earlier. Why? Instead, we both assumed the situation was simple. A child liked a jacket. Other children noticed. Time would solve the rest. But roles have a strange way of delaying understanding. When people believe they already understand someone's story, they stop searching for deeper explanations. So the weeks continued. Eli wore the jacket. The jokes continued quietly among students. Teachers occasionally corrected small teasing, and I remained the quiet parent who seemed unconcerned. Until one evening in early December, when something happened that made me realize the situation might not be as simple as everyone believed. Not dramatic, not loud, just a single moment at home that changed the way I looked at that jacket forever. The moment that changed everything didn't happen at school. It happened in our kitchen on a quiet Tuesday evening. Nothing about that day had seemed unusual. Eli came home, placed his backpack by the door, and sat at the table to work on his homework the same way he always did. The navy jacket stayed on. By then, it had been nearly 2 months since he started wearing it every day. I had grown used to seeing it. The slightly worn cuffs, the careful stitching I had done along the sleeve. Still, that evening, something caught my attention. Eli was writing a short paragraph for a school assignment. I stood at the sink washing dishes while he worked, occasionally glancing over to see how he was doing. At one point, he paused, gripping his pencil tightly. Not frustrated, just thoughtful. Then he lifted his left arm slightly and adjusted the sleeve of the jacket. For a brief second, the fabric pulled back just enough for me to notice something unusual. There was extra stitching inside the sleeve. Not the stitching I had done. Something different. Small, careful, almost hidden. I dried my hands and walked closer to the table. Can I see your jacket for a second? I asked casually. Eli's pencil stopped moving. He looked up at me, not nervously, but with a sudden alertness that I hadn't seen before. Why? I just want to check something. He shook his head gently. I'd rather keep it on. The answer wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive either. It was simply firm. That was new. Eli had always been cooperative about small things. If I asked him to hand me a book or move his backpack, he never objected. But this time, he didn't move. Instead, he slid his hand along the sleeve as if smoothing the fabric. I like it how it is, he said. Something in his voice made me stop asking questions. Parents learn to recognize when a child is guarding something important. Pushing too hard in that moment can feel like breaking a fragile trust. So I stepped back. Okay, I said softly. Finish your homework. He nodded and returned to writing. But while I went back to the sink, my mind stayed with that sleeve, because I was certain of one thing. Those stitches hadn't been there when I bought the jacket. Later that night, after Eli went to bed, I passed by his room and noticed the jacket hanging carefully on the back of his chair. For a moment, I considered stepping inside and looking at it more closely. I even reached for the door. Then I stopped. Trust works both ways. If Eli had chosen not to explain something yet, there was probably a reason. And whatever that reason was, it mattered enough for him to protect it. So instead of opening the door, I turned off the hallway light and went to bed. But that quiet moment changed something inside me. Until then, I had believed Eli was simply tolerating the teasing at school. Now, I have realized something different. He wasn't just tolerating it, he was choosing to endure it. Because whatever was hidden inside that jacket mattered more to him than the opinions of his classmates. And once I understood that, the situation looked completely different. The teasing, the whispers, the way he never took the jacket off. None of it was accidental. Eli was protecting something. I just didn't know what. And sometimes when a child decides to protect something alone, it means they believe the responsibility belongs to them, not the adults, not the teachers, just them. I didn't realize yet how heavy that responsibility had already become for him, or how long he had been carrying it quietly. But from that night forward, I started watching more carefully. Not to interfere, just to understand. Because whatever was hidden in that jacket, it was the reason my son had been willing to stand alone for months. And that kind of determination rarely appears without a very important reason. After that evening, I stopped looking at the jacket as something ordinary. Before, it had been just a piece of clothing. A small mystery, maybe, but still something simple. Now it felt different, intentional. And once I started seeing it that way, other small details began to stand out. Eli didn't just wear the jacket, he maintained it. Every afternoon when he came home, he hung it neatly on the same chair in his room. If the fabric picked up dust or lint, he brushed it off carefully. When the zipper caught slightly one morning, he spent several minutes adjusting it until it moved smoothly again. Children rarely treat clothing with that level of attention, unless the object means something more. At school, the teasing hadn't disappeared, but it had changed in tone. Because Eli never reacted. That's one of the quiet rules of childhood dynamics. When someone protests loudly, teasing can escalate. But when someone stays calm, the people doing the teasing eventually become unsure of what reaction they're supposed to receive. Still, the comments continued occasionally. One Friday afternoon, while waiting near the entrance, I overheard a small group of students again. "Does he ever wash that thing?" one boy asked. Another shrugged. "Maybe he just doesn't have other clothes." They laughed. Eli walked past them without slowing down. No anger, no embarrassment, just the same steady walk he always had. And something about that calmness created a strange effect. Instead of looking defeated, he looked certain. Like someone who understood something the rest of the room didn't. At home, I noticed another small change. Eli had started locking his bedroom door at night. Not every night, just occasionally. The first time I heard the soft click of the lock, I paused in the hallway. Eli had never done that before. But again, I didn't confront him about it. Trust, especially with thoughtful children, grows when you allow space for them to carry certain responsibilities themselves. Instead, I simply adjusted. I began paying attention in quieter ways. One Saturday morning, while Eli was outside riding his bike, I passed by his room and noticed the jacket hanging on the chair again. The sleeve with the extra stitching faced the wall, carefully positioned, almost as if he had thought about where the seam would be least visible. I didn't touch it, but I stood there for a moment longer than usual, because the more I observed, the clearer something became. Eli wasn't hiding the jacket. He was protecting what was inside it, and the teasing at school had become something else entirely. It wasn't just something he endured. It was something he had accepted as the cost of protecting that hidden thing. That realization changed the way I approached everything afterward. Before, I had been quietly monitoring a social situation at school. Now I was witnessing something deeper, a private commitment my son had made, without asking anyone else for help. The adults around him still saw the surface story, the kid with the same jacket, the quiet parent who never complained. But beneath that simple narrative, another story was unfolding. one that none of the teachers had noticed yet. One that Eli clearly believed he had to carry alone. And the strange thing was, the more certain he seemed about protecting it, the more determined I became not to break that trust prematurely. Because if Eli had chosen silence, it meant he believed silence mattered. So I did something that surprised even me. I chose silence too. Not out of ignorance, not out of avoidance, but as a decision. I would wait. I would observe. And eventually, the truth would reveal itself. Because secrets that require that much effort to protect rarely stay hidden forever. Especially in a place as observant as a classroom. All it takes is one moment. One curious teacher. One unexpected discovery. And the entire story begins to shift. By the time winter arrived, Eli's jacket had become part of the landscape of the classroom. Something familiar. Something predictable. And when something becomes predictable, people stop examining it closely. The students had already built their quiet narrative about it. The teachers had already filed it away as a harmless quirk. Even the other parents seemed to accept it without curiosity. Occasionally, someone would mention it lightly in the parking lot. "Kids get attached to strange things sometimes," one mother said once with a small laugh. I simply nodded, because the truth was, by that point, I had begun noticing things that no one else seemed to see. Eli wasn't just protecting the jacket, he was organizing his life around it. It showed up in small patterns. When he sat at the kitchen table doing homework, he often kept one hand resting along the left sleeve. Not gripping it, just present. When we left the house, he always zipped the jacket fully before stepping outside, even if he planned to take it off later. And whenever we were around other people, his posture shifted slightly, as if he was instinctively aware of where the sleeve faced. These weren't the habits of a child hiding something carelessly. They were the habits of someone guarding something deliberately. The more I watched, the more I realized how much quiet planning Eli had already done. One Saturday afternoon, I asked him if he wanted to visit a friend from school. He shook his head. "I'm okay staying home." "Are you sure?" I asked. "You used to play with Jordan sometimes." Eli thought about it. Then he gave a small shrug. "I'd rather just work on my science kit." Again, it wasn't sadness. It was a choice. That same evening, while organizing laundry in the hallway, I noticed something else. Eli had stopped wearing his other jackets entirely. They hung untouched in the closet, even when they might have been warmer. At first glance, it looked like a child simply preferring a favorite piece of clothing. But when you stepped back, the pattern told a different story. The jacket wasn't just clothing anymore. It had become a responsibility. Children rarely carry responsibilities like that without believing they're important. Sometimes important enough to accept discomfort. Sometimes important enough to accept being misunderstood. And that's what most people around Eli had begun to misunderstand. They believed his silence meant indifference, that he simply didn't care what other kids said. But what they didn't realize was something much deeper. Eli wasn't ignoring them. He had simply decided that explaining the truth wasn't worth the risk. The risk of someone touching the jacket. The risk of someone discovering what he was protecting before he was ready. One evening in late January, while we were eating dinner, I asked him a question I hadn't asked before. "Does your teacher ever say anything about the jacket?" He shook his head. "Not really." "And the other kids?" "Sometimes." He took another bite of food, then added quietly, "But it's okay." That phrase stayed with me long after the dishes were washed. It's okay. Children rarely say that when something is truly easy. They say it when they've made peace with something difficult. And that's when I realized how much emotional discipline Eli had already developed. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't even asking for help. He was simply holding on to something he believed mattered. What none of us knew yet, not the students, not the teachers, not even me, was that the truth inside that jacket had already been sitting quietly in that classroom for months, waiting. Because eventually, someone was going to notice something unusual, something small, something that didn't quite match the simple story everyone believed. And once that moment happened, the entire situation would shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet, undeniable way that truth has when it finally surfaces. And when it did, the teacher who first discovered it would realize something that made her stop mid-sentence in the middle of a normal school day. Something that explained why Eli refused to take that jacket off, and why the teasing that had lasted for months suddenly became very difficult for anyone to laugh about anymore. The truth didn't surface during a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation in the hallway, no sudden argument between students. It happened during something much quieter, a routine classroom activity. It was a Thursday morning in early February. The class was working on a small group science assignment, something about ecosystems and how different living things support each other. The students were gathered around tables, passing worksheets back and forth while Ms. Callahan moved between groups answering questions. Later, she would describe the moment to me in very simple terms. "At first, I thought Eli had just snagged his sleeve on something," she said. Apparently, one of the students sitting across from him had pointed toward the jacket. "Your sleeve's ripped," the boy said. Eli looked down quickly. For a brief second, the cuff of the sleeve had shifted. Just enough. Ms. Callahan noticed the movement from a few steps away and walked closer, assuming it was nothing more than a small tear that needed attention. "Eli," she said gently, "do you need to take your jacket off for a moment? We can fix that." Eli immediately shook his head. "I'm okay." His response was polite, but unusually quick. Teachers develop instincts about those kinds of reactions. When a child refuses help too quickly, it often signals that something deeper is happening. So Ms. Callahan crouched slightly beside the desk. "Let me just take a look," she said. Eli hesitated. For the first time in months, he slowly began to unzip the jacket. The classroom was still buzzing with quiet conversation from the other groups. Most of the students weren't paying attention, but Ms. Callahan was. Eli carefully rolled the sleeve back just a few inches. That was when she saw it. Inside the sleeve, carefully stitched into the lining, was a small folded photograph. The extra stitching I had noticed weeks earlier wasn't decorative. It was holding something in place. Ms. Callahan blinked in surprise. "Eli, what is that?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Children sometimes freeze when a secret they've guarded for months suddenly becomes visible. Then he reached into the sleeve, slid the photograph out carefully, and held it between his fingers. It was slightly worn from being carried so long. A picture of two people standing beside each other, a young boy and an older man. Eli's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "It's my dad." Ms. Callahan later told me that the entire moment lasted less than a minute. But something about the way Eli said those words made her pause. "Why do you keep it in your jacket?" "Hasta," she asked softly. Eli looked down at the photo for a moment before answering. "Because I promised him." "Promised him what?" "That I wouldn't lose it." He slid the photograph gently back into the sleeve. "Jackets don't fall out of your pockets," he explained in a simple, logical tone. "And nobody takes your sleeves." Ms. Callahan felt the room shift slightly around them. "Why can't you keep it in your backpack?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "My backpack gets left in the hallway sometimes." "And your desk?" "People borrow pencils from desks." He looked back up at her with a kind of calm certainty. "But no one takes your jacket if you're wearing it." That was the moment Ms. Callahan realized something important. Eli hadn't been wearing the jacket out of comfort. He had been wearing it as a safe place, a place where something important to him couldn't disappear. She asked one final question. Why is the picture so important? Eli answered without hesitation. Because it's the last one we took before he left. The classroom noise continued around them, but Ms. Callahan later told me she barely heard it anymore. Because suddenly the entire story made sense. The jacket, the teasing, the refusal to take it off. Eli wasn't hiding something embarrassing. He was protecting something meaningful. And the thing he had been protecting all those months was a promise. When Ms. Callahan told me the story later, she said the most difficult part wasn't discovering the photograph. It was deciding what to do next. Because once a teacher realizes something deeply personal about a student, there are always choices. Some are simple, some are complicated, and some can quietly change the way an entire classroom behaves. In that moment, sitting beside Eli's desk, Ms. Callahan had several options. She could have gently asked him to keep the photo somewhere safer, perhaps in the school office or with me at home. She could have told the class about it immediately, hoping the explanation would stop the teasing. Or she could have simply acknowledged the moment and allowed Eli to continue protecting the photo the way he had chosen. Each option carried consequences. Children can be surprisingly sensitive to how adults handle private things. If she announced the story publicly, Eli might suddenly become the center of attention in a way he had never asked for. If she insisted he remove the photo, she might break the quiet system he had created to keep it safe. So, Ms. Callahan did something very simple. She respected the promise. She nodded gently and said, "That sounds like something very important." Eli nodded once. Then he zipped the jacket back up. The sleeve returned to exactly the same position it had always been. And the class continued working on their science project as if nothing unusual had happened. But of course, something had changed. Not for the students yet. They still saw the same story they had always believed. The boy with the jacket. The quiet target of occasional jokes. But for Ms. Callahan, the story looked completely different now. And once an adult sees the truth behind a child's behavior, it becomes impossible to return to the earlier assumptions. That afternoon, after school ended, she sat alone in her classroom for several minutes thinking about what she had learned, because the discovery carried another realization with it. Eli had endured months of teasing, not because he couldn't defend himself, but because explaining the truth would have required revealing something he had promised to protect. And that kind of loyalty in a child is rare, especially when the cost is being misunderstood. Later that evening, Ms. Callahan sent me an email asking if we could talk. The message was calm and respectful. She didn't describe the photograph yet. She simply wrote that she had noticed something important about Eli and wanted to make sure she handled it thoughtfully. When I read the message, I already knew what it might be about, because deep down, I had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for the day when someone else would finally notice what I had only glimpsed from the outside. The careful stitching, the way Eli guarded the sleeve, the quiet determination he carried every day. That night, after Eli went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table reading Ms. Callahan's email again. Not worried, not angry, just thoughtful. Because once the truth was out, even partially, there was another decision to make. Not just for the teacher, but for me as well. The situation had reached a point where silence alone might no longer be enough. Sooner or later, the classroom would need to understand why Eli had been wearing that jacket every single day. And the way that truth emerged would determine something important, whether the story ended with embarrassment or with understanding. So the next morning, I replied to Ms. Callahan. I told her I would be happy to talk. And as I closed my laptop, I realized something quietly important. For months, Eli had been protecting the promise alone. But now someone else had seen it too, which meant the story was about to move into its next stage. Not loud, not dramatic, just the slow, careful shift that happens when truth finally begins to move through a room. The next afternoon, I met Ms. Callahan in the quiet conference room near the front office. It was one of those small rooms schools use for parent meetings. A round table, a few chairs, soft fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly above us. Nothing about the setting felt dramatic, which I appreciated. Ms. Callahan greeted me with the same calm professionalism she always had, but I could tell something about this conversation mattered to her. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "Of course." For a moment, she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. Then she spoke. "Yesterday, during class, I noticed something about Eli's jacket." I nodded slightly. "I thought you might." Her eyebrows lifted just a little. "You already knew?" "I suspected," I said gently. "I saw some stitching in the sleeve a while ago." She exhaled quietly, almost with relief. "I didn't want to push him," she explained. "But when the sleeve shifted, I saw the photograph." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I folded my hands on the table. "Yes," I said softly. "That's his father." Ms. Callahan nodded. "He told me he made a promise." "That sounds like him." For a few seconds, the room was quiet again. Then she asked the question most teachers eventually ask when they discover something like this. "Did you know he was carrying it to school every day?" I shook my head. I didn't know for certain, but I knew something was important to him about that jacket. "And the teasing?" I was aware of it. Her expression shifted slightly, not judgmental, just curious. "You never contacted the school about it?" "No," I said calmly. That answer probably sounded unusual. Many parents would have emailed teachers much earlier, asking for intervention. But I had my reasons. Eli didn't want the jacket questioned, I explained. If adults started focusing on it too much, someone might eventually discover the photo by... Callahan leaned back slightly as the realization settled in. So he endured the teasing to protect it. "Yes." She looked down at the table for a moment. "I wish I had noticed sooner." "You noticed when it mattered," I said. That wasn't just politeness. It was the truth. Because now that she knew, something important had changed. The adults in Eli's world finally understood the real story. But understanding alone wasn't the end of the situation. The teasing had still happened. For months. And the classroom still believed the simple explanation they had created. Ms. Callahan tapped her pen lightly against the notebook in front of her. "I've been thinking about how to handle this," she said. "I imagine you have. I don't want to embarrass Eli by telling the entire class his personal story." "I agree. But I also don't want the teasing to continue if the students misunderstand what's happening." She paused again. "So I'm considering something different." "What kind of different?" "A classroom conversation," she said. "Not about Eli specifically, but about assumptions." She explained her idea carefully. Instead of revealing the photograph directly, she planned to lead the class through a discussion about how people often misunderstand others when they only see the surface of a situation. Children, she believed, could understand that lesson, and if they did, they might begin looking at Eli and his jacket differently. Not with pity, but with respect. I thought about it for a moment. "That sounds reasonable," I said. She nodded slowly. "I just want to make sure I handle it the right way." We stood up to leave the room a few minutes later. As we walked toward the hallway, Ms. Callahan added something quietly. "You know, I've been teaching for 12 years. I waited, and I've never seen a child handle teasing with that much patience. I smiled faintly. "He takes promises seriously." "Yes," she said softly. "He does." Neither of us knew yet exactly how the class would react once the conversation happened. But one thing was already clear. For months, the story about Eli had been built on assumptions. And soon, those assumptions were about to meet the truth. Not loudly, not as punishment, but in the quiet way that understanding sometimes spreads through a room when someone finally asks the right question. The classroom conversation happened the following Monday morning. Ms. Callahan didn't announce it as anything special. She didn't mention Eli's name, and she certainly didn't point to the jacket. Instead, she began the lesson in the same calm tone she used for most discussions. Today, she told the class, we're going to talk about something a little different. The students shifted in their chairs with mild curiosity. Sometimes, she continued, writing a word on the whiteboard, people make assumptions. She underlined the word. An assumption is when we decide we understand something, without actually knowing the full story. A few students nodded. Others looked puzzled. To make it easier, she gave them examples. If someone brings the same lunch every day, we might assume they don't like other food. If someone sits quietly during group work, we might assume they don't have ideas. She paused. But sometimes the real reason is completely different. The room grew quieter. Children may not analyze social behavior the way adults do, but they understand fairness when it's explained in the right language. Then Ms. Callahan asked a simple question. Has anyone ever had someone assume something about them that wasn't true? A few hands slowly went up. One student said people thought he didn't like sports because he preferred reading. Another said people assumed she was shy, even though she just didn't like talking in large groups. The conversation grew gradually. Students began realizing how often assumptions shaped the way they treated each other. Ms. Callahan let the discussion unfold for a while before adding something more specific. Sometimes, she said, a person might do something unusual for a very important reason, a reason they're not ready to explain yet. The students listened carefully. And when we make fun of that person, she continued gently, we might accidentally be laughing at something that matters a lot to them. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. No one spoke immediately. Then one of the boys near the back of the room raised his hand slowly. Like, if someone wears the same jacket every day? The room shifted. A few students glanced toward Eli without turning their heads fully. Ms. Callahan didn't look at him. Instead, she simply said, that could be an example. Silence spread through the room. For months, the jacket had been a joke. Something casual. Something easy. Now the possibility that it had a reason began moving quietly through the students' thoughts. One girl near the window spoke up. Maybe it's important to them. Another student nodded slowly. Yeah, like a lucky thing or something. Ms. Callahan smiled slightly. Exactly. She didn't reveal the photograph. She didn't explain the promise. But she didn't need to. The idea had already taken hold. What if the story we believed wasn't the real one? For children, that realization can be powerful. Because once doubt enters the narrative, the teasing stops feeling funny. It starts feeling uncertain. By the time the class moved on to their math lesson, something subtle had changed. No one apologized directly. Children rarely do that right away. But during recess that afternoon, Eli sat on the bench near the playground reading his book. The group of boys who had teased him earlier walked past. One of them glanced briefly at the jacket, then looked away. No jokes, no whispers, just quiet. Sometimes consequences don't arrive through punishment. Sometimes they arrive through understanding. And once understanding begins to grow, people start realizing what they wish they had done differently. The shift in the classroom didn't happen all at once. Children rarely transform overnight. Habits, even small ones like teasing, take time to unravel. But once the idea of assumptions entered their minds, something subtle began changing in the way they looked at Eli. The jokes stopped first. Not dramatically. They simply faded. No one pointed at the jacket anymore. No one whispered about it during recess. Even the small comments that had once floated casually through the classroom seemed to disappear. But silence, when it follows months of teasing, carries a different kind of weight. Because once children start wondering whether they were wrong, they also begin realizing something uncomfortable. They can't go back and undo what they already said. One afternoon that week, Eli was sitting at his desk working quietly on a reading assignment. Across the table, a boy named Marcus, one of the students who had joked about the jacket earlier in the year, kept glancing toward him. Finally, Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Hey," he said. Eli looked up. Marcus hesitated. "Your jacket, is it like important or something?" Eli studied him for a second. Then he gave the same calm answer he had always given. "I like it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's a cool jacket." The conversation ended there. No apology, no explanation. But the tone had changed. Children often apologize in indirect ways. Instead of admitting they were wrong, they simply adjust their behavior moving forward. And in many cases, that quiet change means more than forced words. Over the next few days, other small things happened. A girl who had once laughed during recess asked Eli if he wanted to join a group project. Another student offered him a turn first during a science demonstration. No one mentioned the jacket directly, but the respect around it had quietly grown. Still, there was another side to the change. Something adults notice more easily than children do. Once students began realizing the story might have been wrong, a different emotion started appearing. Regret. Not loud regret. Just the awkward awareness that something had gone on too long. One Friday afternoon, Ms. Callahan told me about a moment she witnessed during art class. Two students were talking near the supply table. "I think he's had that jacket since September," one of them whispered. The other frowned. "Why didn't we just ask him?" The first student shrugged. "I don't know." That question lingered in the air longer than they probably realized. Why didn't we just ask? It's a question adults ask themselves too when they realize they misunderstood someone. Because the truth was simple. For months, the class had built a story about Eli without ever asking him directly. They had laughed. They had guessed. They had assumed. And now that the possibility of a deeper reason existed, none of those earlier moments could be taken back. Understanding had arrived. But it had arrived late. And that's one of the quiet truths about situations like this. Kindness is easiest before the misunderstanding spreads. Once it's already happened, the only thing people can do is change what they do next. For Eli, though, nothing about his routine changed. He still wore the jacket, still zipped it carefully before leaving the house, still walked through the school doors with the same steady posture he'd had all year. The difference was simply this: the laughter was gone, and in its place was something much quieter. Something the students hadn't known how to offer before: respect. The conversation that finally addressed everything happened about a week later. It wasn't planned as a confrontation. In fact, it started with something ordinary: a group project during social studies. The students were asked to work in teams of 4 to prepare a short presentation. Eli's group included Marcus and 2 other classmates. For most of the assignment, they worked quietly, passing papers, writing notes, and organizing who would read which part of the presentation. But near the end of the activity, Marcus looked across the table at Eli again. He had been quieter than usual all week. Finally, he spoke. "Hey, Eli." Eli looked up. Marcus hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue. Then he asked carefully, "Is the jacket, like, something special?" The other 2 students at the table paused their work, not staring, just listening. Eli didn't react with frustration or embarrassment. He simply rested his pencil on the desk and thought for a moment. Then he answered in the same calm voice he always used. "Yeah." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't push for details. But the silence that followed suggested he understood something important. After a few seconds, he said quietly, "Sorry if we were being annoying about it before." It wasn't a dramatic apology. No speeches, no emotional moment, just a simple sentence from one kid to another. Eli studied him briefly. Then he gave a small shrug. "It's okay." And that was it. No explanation about the photograph. No mention of the promise. Eli didn't feel the need to justify the jacket now that the teasing had stopped. The group simply returned to working on their project, but the tone of the conversation had shifted permanently. Later that afternoon, Ms. Callahan noticed something subtle during recess. Eli was sitting on the bench reading again, the jacket zipped halfway up like always. Marcus and two other boys were playing nearby with a soccer ball. At one point, the ball rolled toward Eli's feet. Marcus jogged over to pick it up. For a second, he looked at the jacket sleeve. Then he looked back at Eli. "Hey," he said. "We're short one player if you want to join." Eli thought about it. Then he closed his book and stood up. "Okay." "Yes, I'm not. Ik is a mess." Callahan told me later that nothing about the moment seemed extraordinary to anyone else watching the playground. Just kids playing soccer. But for her, it felt like the final shift. The story the class had believed for months had quietly dissolved. And it hadn't ended with punishment or embarrassment. It had ended with understanding. When I asked Eli about school that evening, he mentioned the game casually while eating dinner. "We played soccer today." "Did you win?" I asked. He shrugged. "I think so." That was all he said about it. The jacket still hung on the back of his chair later that night. The sleeve still held the photograph safely inside. But something important had changed. Eli no longer had to carry the weight of being misunderstood. The promise remained the same, but the silence around it had softened. And sometimes that's all a child really needs. Not attention, not sympathy, just the quiet space to be respected. People often assume that moments like this change children the most. But the truth is, they change parents too. Before that school year, I had always believed my role as Eli's mother was simple. Protect him when something was wrong, speak up when he needed support, and make sure the world treated him fairly. That's the instinct most parents carry. But this experience quietly shifted my understanding of something important. Sometimes protecting a child doesn't mean stepping in immediately. Sometimes it means trusting the strength they're already building. For months, I had watched Eli walk into school wearing that jacket. I had heard the comments from other children. I had seen the small ways he carried himself when people didn't understand him. And many times, I wondered if I should step in earlier. Send an email, request a meeting, explain the story myself. But each time I thought about doing that, I remembered the way Eli protected that sleeve. The careful stitching, the quiet determination, the promise he had chosen to carry. That promise didn't belong to me. It belonged to him. What surprised me most was realizing how calmly he carried it. Children are often more resilient than adults expect. Not because they don't feel pain, but because they often understand purpose more clearly than we think. Eli knew why the photograph mattered. He knew why it needed to stay safe. And because he understood that purpose, the teasing around it never had the power to break him. When the truth finally surfaced, the outcome wasn't loud or dramatic. No one was punished. No speeches were made, but something meaningful happened in that classroom. The students learned that the stories we create about other people are often incomplete. And Eli learned something just as important. That holding on to something meaningful, even when others misunderstand you, is a kind of strength. As for me, I realized that the quiet role people had assigned to me wasn't entirely wrong. I am quiet. I do observe more than I speak, but quiet doesn't mean passive. Sometimes quiet's simply that you're waiting for the right moment for truth to reveal itself. That moment came. Not because I forced it. Not because Eli explained it, but because eventually someone asked the right question. Now, when I see Eli hanging the jacket on the back of his chair at night, I don't just see a piece of clothing anymore. I see a small symbol of something much larger: loyalty, patience, and the quiet courage it takes to keep a promise even when no one else understands it yet. The jacket is still hanging on the back of Eli's chair, not every day anymore. As winter turned into spring, the weather slowly warmed, and Eli eventually began leaving the house without it sometimes. The photograph inside the sleeve now rests in a small wooden box on his bookshelf, but the jacket is still there, folded carefully, protected in the same quiet way Eli protected it for months. Every once in a while, I see him pick it up and look at the sleeve for a moment before placing it back again. He doesn't say anything when he does it. He doesn't need to. Some promises don't need to be repeated. They simply live inside the choices people make. When I think back to that school year, what stays with me most isn't the teasing or the misunderstanding. It's the lesson that came afterward. Most of the time, when people laugh at someone for being different, they're not trying to be cruel. They're just reacting to the story they think they understand. But the truth is, we rarely see the full story behind someone's choices. The quiet kid in the corner might be carrying something important. The strange habit someone has might be protecting something meaningful. And the person we assume we understand might be living a reality we've never even considered. Eli never asked his classmates for sympathy. He never explained the promise unless someone discovered it by accident. He simply did what he believed was right and trusted that eventually the truth would stand on its own. And eventually, it did. Not through revenge, not through embarrassment, but through something much quieter. Understanding. That's the kind of ending I believe in. Not one where people are punished for misunderstanding, but one where they learn to look more carefully the next time they see someone doing something they don't immediately understand. Because the truth is, every classroom, every workplace, every community has someone who is quietly carrying a story the rest of the room can't see. So I want to ask you something before this story ends. If you saw a child wearing the same jacket every day, would you laugh as the other kids did at first? Or would you stop for a moment and wonder what story might be hidden inside it?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.